Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first quarterly webinar of 2023 by the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment. My name is Colleen McLaughlin, and I recently joined the A4 Programming Committee as co-chair with Dr. Margaret Whitaker. Meg will be our primary moderator today. We're very excited to host this webinar with the Environmental Working Group and Personal Care Products Council on Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, MoCRA, changes to U.S. cosmetics laws to support consumer trust in cosmetics ingredients. We're absolutely thrilled at the level of interest this webinar topic generated. Please note this is a Zoom meeting. We look forward to an interactive session, but pay attention to the next few housekeeping slides so we can provide a good experience for everyone. So with so many attendees today, we did not want to hold back on encouraging you to join A4. A4 is a professional association solely dedicated to advancing the science, practice, and policy of alternative assessment and informed substitution. A4 is an interdisciplinary community of researchers and practitioners from government agencies, academia, industry, and nonprofits, all working collaboratively to accelerate the transition to the use of safer chemicals, materials, processes, and products. The best way to engage with A4 is by becoming a member. You'll receive many benefits by joining, and we'll have a chance to collaborate with a great group that is dedicated to alternatives assessment. To learn more and join, please visit our website. And you can see here, we have the link. We'll put the link in the chat for the membership landing page. We have membership rates for professionals and a discounted rate for students. If you're new here, sign up for our email list to receive quarterly newsletters and the latest updates on future webinars like these, as well as workshops and events. If you've engaged with us before but haven't seen our emails in a while, please check your spam folders and make A4 a trusted sender. If you like what you've seen today, please share it with your network and follow us on social media. So welcome. Our goal today is not to provide yet another MoCRA 101 webinar, but to explore the intersection of MoCRA, safer chemistry, and alternatives assessment, and how EWG and PCPC can provide resources to our community as well as consumers. For today's webinar, our primary goals are to learn about the significant update to U.S. federal cosmetics regulations and dig into specific provisions from an A4 lens, including substantiation of safety. We'll discuss continued needs to support safer chemical ingredient selection in cosmetics, and you'll learn about tools, resources, and strategies to drive continuous improvement. Again, welcome. Thank you for attending our webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Meg so she can introduce our speakers and give an overview of MoCRA.
Great. Thank you very much, Colleen. Colleen has big shoes to fill now that Lauren Hine is our president of A4, so we're excited to have Colleen with us co-chairing the program committee of the A4. Here's a great quote. I just used it for SOT. I was reading Yeats in my free time, and he said, "There are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met." And that's what makes A4 so special. We're able to talk about sometimes controversial topics, but do so in a respectful way, because our goal is to advance safer chemical, material, services, and product selection. So with that kind of note, I want to introduce today's panelists. I think this A4 webinar is probably going to be the largest attendance webinar because these are three very well-known people who have expertise in this sector. Let's start out by introducing Jay Ansell. He's a chemist and board-certified toxicologist. Those two normally don't go together. As vice president of PCPC's cosmetic programs, Jay is responsible for providing technical support to PCP staff, committees, and task forces addressing the science and regulation of personal care products. He brings more than 30 years of experience leading global regulatory affairs and quality initiatives in the personal care products and specialty chemicals sector. Then we have Kim from the PCPC as well. She's also a board certified toxicologist, and she serves on the board of directors for the American Board of Toxicology. Kim joined PCPC as senior director, safety and regulatory toxicology in May of 2022. And she supports safety-related issues for cosmetic ingredients and products, leading technical committees and engaging with domestic and international science and regulatory organizations. Then Homer. Homer needs no introduction. Homer Sway leads EWG's Healthy Living Science team, and he oversees its research and market change work on chemical ingredients and everyday items like personal care, but also food and cleaning products. Homer spearheads the EWG Verified program, which sets rigorous science-based standards with the goal of moving the market to answer consumer demands for safer choices for all of these product types. He joins EWG as a research and development expert after 30 years in the private sector, where many of us knew him when he was back at J&J, for example. So with that, these are our three speakers. I want to make sure they all have their cameras on. Some of our attendees are familiar with EWG or PCPC, but some have never even heard of your organizations. So let's just kick off. Let's go to the next slide. And let's hear a little bit about each organization before we move into the nitty-gritty of MoCRA. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for the invitation for us to participate in this webinar. And thank you for the introduction. So a little bit about PCPC. For those unfamiliar with the Personal Care Products Council, we are an established trade organization, as you can see by the founded in 1894, based in Washington, D.C. And we're the leading national trade association representing cosmetics, personal care companies, and we represent companies of all sizes, small, medium sized to large global companies, and serve as the voice on scientific, legal, regulatory, legislative, and international issues for the industry. So our membership, representing, let's say, 600 companies, presents more than 90% of the U.S. beauty industry. So it's manufacturing, distributing, and supplying the majority of personal care products in the U.S., and also serving as a global leaders committed to product safety, quality, and innovation. Also, PCPC continually engages with key audience, policymakers, regulators, NGOs, retail partners, consumers, and the news media, and being able to participate in webinars like this. And we share the complexity and scientific sophistication of personal care products and the importance of harmonizing regulations for the industry, which is a great topic for today, with harmonizing those regulations and creating really a uniform national framework for cosmetic regulations with MoCRA.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. Let's hear a little bit about EWG, Homer.
Thanks, Meg. Hey, look, I think most people know of EWG, but not what EWG is and who EWG is. EWG, we are scientists, toxicologists, chemists, formulators, advocates, educators, all working together with the mission of helping people live healthier and more empowered lives. On this screen here, you just see some of the things we're working on. But I think the way I would like to present ourselves, our science team, is we have two branches of our science team. One of them is what we call investigations, research arm. You might be familiar with some of the work, some of our testing on water and wildlife, on products, air. Some of notable research that we've done is on tap water database or pesticides in Ventura County and the PFAS in fish that was recently published. I lead what we call the Healthy Living Science team. Healthy Living Science basically means translating the science into action aimed at personal and public health. You may know of some of our products, the three consumer databases: Food Scores for food products, Healthy Cleaning for household cleaning products, and Skin Deep for personal care and cosmetic products. These are all available free to the public. The Skin Deep database is amazing. There is almost 100,000 products in that database and more than 10,000 ingredients in that database, something truly, truly amazing. You may also know of us from our verification, our certification work that we call Verified. Here we are certifying personal care products, baby products, diaper products, and cleaning products. And new this year is recreational sunscreens. Taken together, my estimate is these products represent about the top 5% of the products in Skin Deep with respect to health, safety, and transparency. Thank you all. Yeah, back to you.
That's great. Next slide, please. So this isn't a webinar on MoCRA 101. Next slide. But it is important as we engage with our panelists and ultimately the participants on MoCRA is just a very broad overview of it. It is really the first major amendment to laws affecting the FDA and cosmetics since the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act was signed in 1938. That in itself is groundbreaking. But it does include the following 5 provisions, and it does contain other provisions, but we're not going to go into MoCRA today. But it does include mandatory cosmetic facility registration. It does require FDA to promulgate good manufacturing practice regulations for cosmetic facilities. It does require serious adverse event reporting to FDA. It does require safety substantiation to be kept on file and maintained. And it does require FDA to promulgate regulations about fragrance allergen disclosure, standardized asbestos test methods for talc products, and then it will require FDA to assess the use and safety of PFAS in cosmetics. So that's a lot of stuff. And it's a good lens for us to focus our discussion on issues that we hold near and dear to our hearts at A4, safer ingredient selection. So I like to think of it as MoCRA is the lens that we should use to talk about how we can strategize the role that AA plays in safer chemical selection and pushing continuous improvement in the cosmetics sector. So with that, let's go to the next slide. I've got 5 questions, and the purpose of the webinar is to have a discussion by all panelists. So remember, we've only got a limited amount of time. So panelists, please try and keep your responses relatively brief, and let's hear from different panelists. But let's start out, I love zinger questions with, well, what's missing from MoCRA? What needs to be still fulfilled as an example, especially in regards to ensuring that safe chemical ingredients are used in cosmetics. So I picked a number out of my hat, and let's let Kim start out, let's say, with answering that question.
Sure.
What's missing from MoCRA?
Sounds good. So from the PCPC perspective, I think one of the biggest things we find missing is that there's not, a ban on animal testing for cosmetics within MoCRA. And we've all been working for, this a long time. The cosmetics fragrance industry has really championed the methods that have replaced the animals for many of the endpoints. And also we've been working as an industry without using animals for our safety assessments for a while. But so that's, I think, what we saw is kind of an obvious, okay, that's missing. But we're still, supporting the Humane Cosmetics Act, which is, at the federal level to prohibit animal testing for cosmetics. We do have various, state regulations for that, but we would like to see a federal bill for that. And so when we talk about alternatives, just Jay and I were discussing, the terminology for kind of the cosmetics industry has been alternatives, meaning alternatives to animal testing.
That's a good point. Jay or Homer?
First, I'll follow. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, well, I think Kim mentioned animal testing. I was just thinking that, in terms of your presentation, we certainly didn't want to spend a lot of time on MoCRA 101, but there are a number of new powers that have been introduced, and I think our attendees, the participants, should be aware of some of these really significant new powers that are granted FDA through MoCRA, including mandatory recalls, facility suspension, record access, including, you mentioned adverse event reporting, and of course, the GMP provisions, I think are critical. So I'll just throw them out as additional elements to MoCRA that I think are important.
I'll go next. Within any big sector, there's always variability. What MoCRA does is take away much of that variability with some of the instruments that Jay just mentioned. The variability that remains, though, if you compare with the previous versions of cosmetic reform, is a horizontal assessment of safety on ingredients. This one has only 2, PFAS and maybe you can call it talc. But the rest are still open, basically to however the manufacturer wants to define it and assess it. That's still an open question that I hope that variability is closed sometime in the future.
Mhm. So what does MoCRA mean for consumers then? Obviously, people are trying to formulate products that make people feel better, more beautiful, sometimes healthier. What does it mean for them?
Sure, I can start with that one.
Mhm.
So, as a consumer-facing industry, I think, as just the basic rule, anything that promotes consumer confidence is good, and MoCRA should do that. And it's not enough just to have safe products. The consumers really need to have that confidence and trust in those products. And I think, just being able to create a uniform framework for cosmetics should, reflect the commitment to safety for these products and give consumers, it's like this is increased tools for the FDA, but it's also increased tools for consumers, right? To understand what's going into the safety assessments and the whole product life cycle of safety of the product. Because we also, within MoCRA is the adverse events, as you mentioned. So really just emphasizing with the consumers that FDA has additional tools now to ensure the safety of cosmetics, to protect human health, and to reinforce that consumer confidence. And then more specifically, things like transparency. So one is around fragrance allergen disclosure. And, this is a big area of, concern for individuals that may have an allergy to a fragrance. So, we'll be working with the FDA on determining what will be the standard, what allergens, will need to be disclosed. But as part of, let's say, the existing PCPC consumer commitment code, the recommendation is to disclose the 26 internationally recognized contact allergens. So a lot of that is currently in place, but of course, we can always go further. And then another piece I'll just quickly mention around the concept of transparency is labeling. So within MoCRA, there's the requirement for professional products. So those products used in more of like a salon setting to have the appropriate labeling like products on retail shelves do, which I think, is a great move forward to ensure the safety of workers and also to just allow them to see all that information when they're using a product in their work setting.
Those are good points. And Homer, what from EWGs and your perspective, what does MoCRA mean for consumers?
It's important that we don't lose sight of the person inside personal care products. For those estimated 10,000 to 100,000 of Americans that experience injury every year with personal care products, MoCRA provides hope that with mandatory adverse events for reporting that somebody is listening and their voices will be heard. For those 150 million consumers that have sensitive skin, to Kim's point, MoCRA offers transparency to additional information, fragrance allergen information that's already available to citizens in other countries. For those 330 Americans that use personal care products, MoCRA offers faith that manufacturers will use the golden rule of first do no harm, where they substantiate their products before they go on the marketplace. 3 big promises for sure. A lot has to be done in addition to this to fully restore the confidence and trust back into consumer products and personal care products. But Drew and I are going to work together very closely to make sure all this happens. Give our full support, to the FDA to make sure that this works. Back to you.
Thanks. And no vacation for you, Homer. A lot of work to do. Jay,
Not
do you
yet.
have anything to add as well, Jay?
No, I think that captures it very nicely, and the consumer confidence in the FDA is critical to both the industry and consumers. So.
And then, well, let's talk about, so it sounds like MoCRA is going to build a lot of trust and help consumers. What does this mean for product manufacturers? Because especially smaller ones who aren't members of PCPC, for example. Let's start with Homer. What does it mean? What if you don't have a lot of resources? What does this mean for small, medium, and then large size companies? What is MoCRA going to do?
Standard. It says everybody shall do the following things, so that's helpful. But I'm not clear what resources might be available in order for everybody to meet that standard. Information is variable in the marketplace. Expertise is variable from company to company. I think we've got to find a way, and that's why I was going back to we need a horizontal assessment so that everybody has equal access to it. I'm not clear how companies will, big and small, are going to adjust for this. Let me turn it back to to my colleagues at PCPC. They probably would know more than I do here. Go.
No, I think that's it. You know, we keep coming back to one of the greatest strengths that as an industry we have is confidence in FDA, consumer confidence. Not, you know, we are confident in the safety of our materials, but that's not enough. You know, the consumers have to be confident in and believe in the safety of these materials. Clearly, we will get a national uniformity. I mean, just from a basic standpoint, the idea of addressing state by state or county by county or even towns issuing their own versions of cosmetic regulation is very problematic. So national uniformity for these elements is great for industry. We didn't mention that the Office of Cosmetics and Colors, which has been a part of the food group, CISAN, has been relocated to the Commissioner's office. And we think that's important as well. It will bring a lot more visibility to and attention to MoCRA implementation. So we're looking forward to the office moving. And of course, as Homer mentioned, clarity. We think that things like that we've urged on a voluntary basis becoming mandatory, there will be implementing regulations to explain exactly what formulas need to be described. Have a standard for GMP, talk about how adverse events should record should be kept for adverse events and reporting for serious adverse events. So national uniformity, clarity, and an elevated position for cosmetics within FDA, I think, are all good news for the industry.
And Kim, do you have feedback too?
Sure, I'll just close out with, we're thinking about the industry of those companies manufacturing and marketing products. I see this as pulling in the other kind of key players in the industry, which are facilities, the contract manufacturers and the suppliers, and how MoCRA, many of the regulation, it touches not only the companies, but all of that would apply to the facilities and the suppliers. And, like one example would be around the fragrance allergens that FDA now would have authority if they have a concern about something causing injury to consumers, to be able to go in and have to access information on the details of that fragrance ingredient. So that would be, working, the companies working with their suppliers to be able to make sure that all of that information and those processes work very well.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said. Is PCPC working with other trade associations, the smaller ones, International Beauty Association and things like that? Is there a generic discussion among associations about how to do all these things and how to help suppliers? And so are you doing that too collaboratively?
I mean, certainly, MoCRA has been a generational activity. I mean, our CEO joined the effort 15 years ago to advance a modernization of cosmetic regulations. And during that period, we've worked with all sorts of stakeholders, both on the industry side, like professional beauty, but also with EWG and other NGOs. So there are a lot of people who've had an input and participated in these discussions to deliver, bring MoCRA over the finish line at the end of 2022.
Yeah, a lot of work went into it, and it did not occur overnight. That's for sure.
That's right.
Well, many of us consider ourselves alternatives assessors in addition to risk assessors, but a lot of people who listen to our webinars want to dig into what tools and what resources are there, and training as well, so that they can get to a place so that informed chemical substitution or formulating in the right way, so we don't have to worry about adverse event reporting. How can that occur? Homer, let's spend about 5 minutes or so describing some of the resources that each of your organizations and training offers. For those of you on the webinar, we will be posting a recording of the webinar, including everything in the chat, through our website, saferalternatives.org. You just click on the resources tab and you'll be able to see us in living color for longer than it took to create MoCRA. So Homer, how about telling us what are some of the resources at EWG that people can use, particularly formulators, suppliers, to get to safer?
A little segue before I get there. So just to put things into context, it's never been clear to me that we have the right tools in the marketplace today. Just consider the contrast. On one side, industry is spending millions, probably billions on safety every year. On the other side, the medical community is telling me that we're losing ground to allergens and asthma and chronic diseases. Now, that's more complicated than just personal care, but personal care plays a role for sure. This is a strange thing that's happening, and I think it's because we don't have the right tool sets in there. That's why I'm so interested in all the work that you all are doing. A4, Chem Forward, Cradle to Cradle, safety, EPA, Safer Choice. We have a different tool set. Even EWG has a different tool set. So you all have alternative screening. Let me just call it like that. Cradle to Cradle has a circularity discussion there. It's going on. That's pretty interesting. Within EWG, we have a rating system that for ingredients that we combine together to come up with a score from 1 to 10. That was never available to me, when I was in the industry. All the ingredients look the same, but now we can separate them a little bit. And we also have what I call hazard stacking. So ingredients are still assessed one at a time. There is no such thing as a safety profile for a product, but EWG is able to create that through what we call hazard stacking. So you take all the 13 different endpoints, you assign points to each one, and you hazard stack those endpoints on top of each other to create something that represents the product. And that's really cool. That is the methodology that is used within Skin Deep. There's many, many more, but probably at the end of my time, I'll be transferred over to my colleagues here.
Sure, I can jump in with that. I sent a file with a list of lots of resources, so I'll just touch on a few today. But thinking specifically about some of the PCPC stuff, I would start with cosmeticsinfo.org. And this is, I think, useful for, let's say, maybe those individuals doing safety assessment, but it's really meant to be consumer facing. And to really, we're advocating for consumer education to empower consumer choice. So, promoting chemical literacy, having detailed descriptions, of the ingredients used in cosmetics, and also descriptions of product categories and how they're formulated. Also, instructing consumers on how to read a product label, just so they can understand what it is they're choosing. And this is something I think, consumers really can understand if you explain it to them. And also, we have a lot of, collaborations within the dermatology community, working with dermatologists to build information into their systems. So when they have consumers that do have an issue, to resolve like an allergy, they can pull from that information, which is essentially like disclosed information on the products that would not be, to that detail on the product label. So that's one resource we have that's very consumer facing. Also, in terms of, those resources focused at scientists that will be working specifically with a lot of these new regulations of MoCRA, we have guidelines available for quality, safety, and micro that are very extensive and represent best practices in the industry. Also, we have an online info base, which contains comprehensive, really safety and regulatory information on ingredients. Now that I will point out that the online info base is a members only resource, but the others that I mentioned, the guidelines, can be purchased, and the cosmeticsinfo.org is open access to everyone. And of course, at PCPC, we have committees on all of these topics to kind of constantly be, working within industry across companies, small, medium, and large, on best practices, and also, make sure we're meeting the law, of course, for MoCRA, and working on these implementing regulations with FDA. Also, just having things like webinars. We actually have a PCPC host webinar right after this on our online resources like the cosmeticsinfo.org, our Incopedia, and also presenting at workshops. Jay and I'll be presenting at the NYSCC Suppliers Day. So really just trying to get the word out however we can.
Sounds like you're going to be busy. Go ahead, Homer.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jay. Kim, I fully support everything you're saying. There's one statement that always pains me, even when I say consumers go read the label. They can't even read what's on there. The names are very, very difficult. We have to simplify it. And me getting older, I can't even see the label, so we got to find a way to make that easier for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are some, options now that people are working on with QR codes where you can pull it up and expand it on your phone and get the information you need. And also, contacting the companies. I mean, almost everyone has that 1-800 number on back of packed, and you can reach someone immediately to ask questions and get, support as needed. And within the resources I also shared out, I'd just like to point out, there's a lot of collaboration that goes into something like safety. So at PCPC, we do rely on the Cosmetics Ingredient Reviewer CIR reports, and also groups like RIFM, Research Institute for Fragrance Materials. They're covering the fragrances. So it's really a very big collaborative effort.
I'm interested in, well, thanks, Kim. We have a number of resources available, but I'm interested in Homer's content because the dematerialization of the label is something that we all need to work on. By regulation, we are restricted as to what is required to be on the label, but we could make all sorts of information available in other ways if we had more flexibility. One of the things that we've mentioned is allergens, and that's going to present a real problem when we start talking about disclosing 50 or 80 materials on a product label. So it's both a solution to that problem, but also a way that we can make much more information available to consumers if we're allowed to access newer technologies. So we mentioned a number of educational opportunities, which are kind of PCPC things. MoCRA is only at this point 3 months old, and so we've been hard at work talking about implementation plans. A lot of people looked at the passage of MoCRA being the end, but from our standpoint, from a science standpoint, it's just the beginning. We're going to need to develop implementing regulations to address all of these new elements that have been added. But we understand that once we get that rolling, education is going to be a critical element. That will extend, farther than I think our members, primarily focusing on members at this point. But let me also point out an area of my alternatives, alternatives to animal testing, as opposed to the comparative alternatives that perhaps A4 tends to address, that I have a particular passion for, is a recently launched NGO headquartered in New York, the International Collaboration on Cosmetic Safety, which is directed at developing alternative assessments and to really reform and transform how risk assessments are actually done, moving them from animal studies or alternatives trying to predict what would have happened to making the risk assessments more protective. And the idea is that to not only build the capacity to do protective risk assessments and not just mimicking animal studies, but also to expand the capacity to conduct these risk assessments. And so training, working with regulators is our key pillars in that whole effort. So it's an activity that I'm particularly interested in, and I think it offers great promise in terms of conducting risk assessment in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many of us who are toxicologists, or those of us who are old enough to do in vivo testing, it's hard to describe it to newer toxicologists and how to get away from that and how to still interpret an old study, though. And yeah, there's lots to do. So that's exciting. I'm glad you're focused on that. And we will get to a place where that really is the norm now. Well, let's move on to somewhat, I'm sure each of your organizations have opinions on this, but what do you think? And let's start out, I guess, let's start with Kim. Do you think there's a role for programs like Safer Choice or Chem Forward Safer to aid in the identification of safer ingredients? And if so, what could that role be?
Yeah, for the cosmetics industry, it's not something I guess we've really been working in that space currently. I was just, reviewing like EPA Safer for Choice recently, and that it does, they will do the assessment for the rinse-off products, but not for the leave-ons. And I think part of that is like, that FDA regulates cosmetics and EPA doesn't. So I think that, there could potentially be that space there. And it's not something, I guess, that, the industry is championed on its own, but once again, it's through collaborations. We've had some collaborations with just participating in discussions with EPA and their work on quantitative structure use relationship models, and trying to make sure that the data for the cosmetic sector is available for them to run those models. And then they come back to us with all this, great information of how it's being used. And so, yeah, I think for us that aspect will be collaboration with the experts in that area to see what this could look like for cosmetics.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about programs like that, and it's not risk versus hazard, but those are hazard-based programs, but they're multi-endpoint. So they're not just focused on, well, is it safe for humans? Is it safe for the environment too, and for organisms in the environment, which is, a tall order, particularly if there are data gaps. And then certain chemistries we can't use yet. Surfactants are really hard to model. So I'm sure the laboratories will have a big place, at the seat at the table, if we want to try and say, we're going to only use surfactants and products that we know are readily biodegradable. So there's just lots of education that's still needed. And hopefully EPA will have the funding to help us get there, because they still have some of the best software out there that's always free. So Homer, what's your opinion on the roles like programs like Safer Choice and Chem Forward or Cradle to Cradle have in terms of trying to get to safer?
Well, one of the reasons why I'm here is because of that question, Meg. What I'm seeing is, if you are part of this industry, you will see this tension between the hazard scientists and the exposure scientists. I mean, the truth be told, both tools are imperfect. What we need to do is start to look across both sides to see what's working. So I'm reaching my hand out to everybody in the audience. Let's come together. We need all the smart scientists to try to figure out some of the challenges that are faced with us. It most definitely has a role. We need to keep innovating on both sides of the fence, both on the exposure science and on the hazard science as well. The best decisions will always be made when we have access to more tools and more data, including on both sides. So maybe on a future conversation through A4, let's figure out what that might look like. But we must stop this infighting. It's not helping anyone. Not helping. Yeah.
I agree. In terms of trying to move to get some participation from participants, and we have lots of them, I'm going to, luckily because I'm the moderator, we have Dr. Jen McPartlin in the audience, I see. And Jen for many years was at the Environmental Defense Fund, and now she's at Beauty Counter. And so she's worn different hats just like Homer. And I wanted to get Jen's, hi Jen, get her feedback, and let's start answering questions and discussions. But could you just give us give us your impressions, Jen, about what we've been discussing, et cetera, in terms of MoCRA?
Yeah, absolutely. The dialogue has been great so far. And I was getting jealous that I wasn't one of the panelists, because I was like, oh, there's something I would love to add right here. But I've taken copious notes. I thought there were a lot of good ideas shared by the panelists. And just a couple of thoughts, with the caveat that I'm not a MoCRA expert. I'm actually more of a TSCA expert. Not that I delve into that expertise in an everyday sort of way, as I here now at Beauty Counter, but couple of things. Historically, Beauty Counter has been a champion of the Safer Beauty Bill package, which was sort of complementary legislation to what ultimately came into law under MoCRA. And there are a couple of really critical pieces of that package that we will at Beauty Counter still take to heart, even if it's not necessarily through a regulatory mandate. And that one of those pieces that I'd really like to highlight is around the disproportionate exposures to harmful chemicals to women and girls of color, or as we like to refer to that space of work and issue as is beauty justice. And so there was a piece of legislation as part of the Safer Beauty package that was explicitly focused on that area and trying to attempting to integrate aspects of equity into overhaul of the federal law. And unfortunately, that provision or provisions in that piece of legislation ultimately didn't come into the letter of the law under MoCRA. But I think we're all hopeful that when sort of we get into the specifics of the implementing regulation, that might afford some opportunity to integrate and represent some of those considerations in the implementation of the law and how we think about safety substantiation. The other thing I'd like to say is for me entering into this space from a policy perspective, which is not how I spend my days any longer, it's very different from what I'm accustomed to in the TSCA arena, whereby the regulatory agency actually performs the chemical assessments In this instance, the onus is on the regulated community or the industry itself. And so I think that there's definitely a rich discussion to have there in terms of consistency and excellency of science when the substantiation responsibility is on the individual companies, and thinking about how we can have like an assurance of excellence and best in class when there isn't, as there is in the TSCA context, an overarching body that holds that responsibility and puts out several 100-page chemical assessments with excruciating detail. So I'm very fascinated to see how the regulatory framework shakes out. You know, at Beauty Counter, we'd like to think that we're already in compliance with MoCRA. Like that's sort of our bread and butter, to be as thoughtful and comprehensive in assessments of our products and of the ingredients that go into our products. It's publicly available information. We take a green screen type of approach to our ingredient assessments. They're extraordinarily comprehensive. We think about not only potential impacts to the user, but to the environment. Meg, as you had referenced earlier, we actually do integrate ecological aspects into our assessments, and we are participants in EWG verified. We have several EWG verified products, and we have sort of rules of the road in terms of what we allow, prohibit, or otherwise restrict in our products. And we borrow from, again, the alternatives assessment, green screen assessment frameworks in helping us define those rules of the road. So we really are not keen on having ingredients that have human health category 1 or human health type 1 hazards. We really try to minimize, if not completely avoid, those types of substances. And then we do have restrictions around what we will allow in rinse-off products, from the vantage of what the potential ecological impacts of that might be.
Homer wants to jump in for a
Oh
second.
yeah, I could tell.
No, I respect Jennifer. She and I kind of.
No, I think
Yeah.
I think that's at this point. I mean, I think that's, you know, there's so much more I could say because the conversation had been so rich. But that was what's in front of my, you know, it's front of mind to me. And I feel like I'm going to just say it for a third time. I really think that the regulations is where the rubber is going to hit the road, and sort of taking these concepts and making them operational. And so for all those that were on this call that were involved possibly in the passage of the legislation, it's like there's still so much important work in terms of bringing that legislation to life. And I hope that folks don't just like bow out. I mean, I'm sure PCPC and EWGs will not, but there was just a lot of folks that were involved in trying to get the legislation passed. In this next phase, while it's maybe not as exhilarating in some ways as passing legislation, is just equally as important. So maybe I would just leave on that, is that I hope that people continue to focus in on the implementing regulation.
I remember a quote from an EPA administrator saying that when he came in, he was looking for people to support him. He said he ultimately learned that the best he could do was that all the stakeholders were equally dissatisfied. So
What I was going to add is, thanks, Jennifer, first. The events at East Palestine really got me to think, what the heck does safe really mean? Safe for whom? Safe for what? Safe for when? Safe for where? I really do hope that we can be more transparent to everyone what we mean by this word safe and how we derive it. What does it mean exactly? I think that will help everyone, including the environmental justice issue that Jennifer was raising earlier.
No, that's a
Thank
good point, because we tend to think of the end user, which is the consumer interface with the product. And one of the things that I'm interested in sort of exploring further now in the context of Beauty Counter is how we can continue to involve the sort of scoping of the receptors that may be exposed along the entire supply chain, not just the person at the end of the day who interacts with our product, but everybody that was along, like anyone that may have in some way interfaced with the product or constituents of the product along the supply chain to get us to that end product, and then who both ecologically speaking and in terms of humans may encounter that product after the life of that product, which is a huge endeavor. But I really appreciate that you raised that point, Homer, because it is something that I'm actively thinking about now here at Beauty Counter. Yeah.
And we're
And just to
participating-
go ahead, Jay.
No, we are participating in some of these groups, and that's of course the challenge. Is what are the edges of the envelope, and it's not just human safety. And so, how do you compare a fish bioaccumulation to a liver no effect level to the amount of energy necessary to move the products, and so yeah, it's very, very complex. And then trying to add the proverbial apples and oranges is very complex. But I did want to just put a little more words around your discussion about industry responsibility on chemical safety. It's not just the industry. Clearly, the industry is the first responsible party, but we have many people who are providing checks and balances to the industry association, the industry conclusions through third parties like the SCCS, like CIR, like the RIFM. And these are all done with full transparency for anyone to read the reports, see the data that was concluded, and agree or for that matter disagree with the conclusions that were drawn. And FDA has a role as well in terms of these safety assessments. So it's more than just industry keeping these documents private. It's much more public than that.
Mm-hmm. What I've seen interestingly among American companies that they've been moving from a qualitative safety assessment approach to a more EU quantitative safety assessment approach. And the resources document that Kim provided to us is the SCCS Notes of Guidance, a link to it that is kind of the cookbook for how to do that. But my comment feeds into, I see Muna Nehar from EPA asked, and it kind of segues into her question, what are some successes with international regulations like the EU cosmetics regulation in the cosmetics and personal care product space? And is it really feasible to integrate some of these into the implementation of MoCRA? Does anyone have any feedback on that?
Sure, I'll just jump in specifically on safety. And Homer mentioned what does safe mean? So we haven't mentioned this, but I'm just going to define how it's defined in MoCRA. The term safe means the cosmetic product, including any ingredient thereof, is not injurious to users under the conditions of use prescribed in the labeling thereof, or under such conditions of use as customary or usual. So we have the definition per MoCRA.
Say that 3 times fast. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, like, specifically for safety substantiation, what they did in the EU Cosmetics Directive and laying out for the EU safety dossier is all of those critical elements of safety. And it's very prescriptive as to what should be in that cosmetic product safety report. But all of those minimal essential elements, whether you're in the EU or Australia or the US, those are the same, right? Those are the elements that you need to ensure your product is safe. So, part of MoCRA is the record keeping. Do we need to combine those essential elements in the same way as prescribed in the EU, dossier? I wouldn't say so, but I think they're defining that. Many of the companies are already using that. I think we know it works, but really we could think, could it be improved particularly in terms of the record keeping aspect and how the reports are organized?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. There is a genius in the FDA style of regulation, really is. There's a genius and there's a danger to it also at the same time. The genius part is, since they don't tell you how to do it, you have to do as much as you can to make sure that you're in compliance, but you're not exactly sure what that means. But there is also a danger, because people can see safety as a cost and minimize that and do as little as possible as well. So we have to find some type of middle ground, right? So the EU style is, they're very prescriptive. They provide that floor, but they don't provide any incentive to do more than that. And so in the US, we have to find a way to keep incentivized, to keep investing in safety, move that envelope up, but also provide a floor, a safeguard that nobody will go below. That's the balance we've got to try to get in the US. We're not there yet.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, yeah, having all of those kind of minimal essential elements, and then how do we keep, kind of raising that floor of, inspiring consumer confidence and spurring innovation. And that could be innovation too with how we, approach safety.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the U.S. versus the EU. Basically, they're structurally framework the same. Industry responsibility, third-party oversight, government responsibility for enforcement. So in a way, I look at it and say everyone gets to write their own regulations, but the science that we're interested in is not regional. Everyone has the same science for conducting safety assessments. I would say looking at the European science, like the notes of guidance, are adopted everywhere.
That sounds great. So it sounds like we all agree that science reigns the day, and that's where A4 can serve a really important role for people. I'd like to hand it over to my program co-chair, Colleen. Thank you very much, panelists. But Colleen, why don't you bring us on home?
Sure. I can't believe the hour's already up. This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Jay, Kim, Homer, Meg for moderating, Jennifer McPartland, everyone who put questions in the chat. And I also really want to thank Molly Jacobs of UMass Lowell, who's been in the background running the show, and she was instrumental in putting this webinar together. So we do have two really quick slides. We want you to save the date and come to Tacoma, Washington for our International Symposium on Alternatives Assessment, October 25th and 26th at the University of Washington. You'll find more information on our website, and we are going to put a poll up. So if you could please respond and let us know what you thought of today's webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the attendees, and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.